Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Politico live event about rewriting the Transatlantic Tech Playbook. I'm Nick Vinacore, Politico's technology editor in Brussels, and I'm here with some very illustrious guests. We have the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, and Mark Warner, the U.S. Senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, here to discuss this crucial topic at an excellent time, just a few days before Europe puts out its AI rules, and in the midst of discussions on everything from digital tax to antitrust enforcement. How much can Europe and the United States work together to write a new transatlantic tech playbook? That's a discussion we're going to have just now after I'm finished speaking. I want to give out a special thanks to our partner Etno for making this virtual event possible. I want to thank everybody who's watching online today, and I want to encourage you to ask questions using Slido. That's sli.do, using the hashtag Transatlantic Tech. Your questions are popping up on my screen over here and for Mark Scott. So anything you want to ask, inject into this conversation, you've got the power to do that right there. We have a little poll, simple question. Will the reset of the tech transatlantic relationship be successful? Yes or no answer. It's pretty straightforward. I'm also going to encourage you to tweet your thoughts as the event is going on at hashtag Transatlantic Tech, and we'll be sure to get plenty of interaction on social media. Without further ado, I want to introduce Liz Forer, who's the Director General of Etno and is going to speak to us now from Brussels, I believe. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon also from me. A huge thank you to Executive Vice President Vestager, to Senator Warner, to Mark Scott, and to the whole Politico team. Etno is proud to help set the scene on a fundamental matter. How can the European Union and the United States reshape their collaboration on digital matters? Here, I take the viewpoint of the telecommunications, which is Europe's first tech sector according to the Forbes 100 Digital Index. When I look at telcos today, I see them engaged in a gigantic task. They must build Europe's new backbone. This is a 300 billion euros challenge to invest in 5G and fiber. Also, telcos are stepping up their game in digital services and data. This is not just a telecom or a tech challenge. It's a European challenge, and it has a strong transatlantic element at heart. So where do Brussels and Washington stand in terms of future digital visions? The poll just gave us some ideas about this, but let me challenge you on and share 4 myths on EU-US tech relations that I would like to demystify. The first myth goes that Europe is protectionist, while the US is the land of no regulation. Here, I got a quote for you. The degree to which tech companies are insisting that they are more like phone company, that they are like The Atlantic, I do not think is tenable. They're making editorial choices, whether they have buried them in algorithms or not. This quote is not from an EU top official, but it's from President Obama. In November 2020, he delivered a moving interview on the future of our democracies. Obama's quote resonates with many initiatives in the US Congress aimed at recognizing the responsibility of tech firms. This means that the American position starts to converge with EU proposals like the Digital Services Act, which Etno supports. The same has happened in the area of data protection, where the GDPR has inspired a profound rethinking of US privacy rights. Second myth, it was said that European antitrust has a bias against American companies and that the Digital Market Act is the end of entrepreneurship. As a tech geek and as a woman, I cannot ignore that President Biden has chosen Lina Khan as his nominee for the Federal Trade Commission. She's one of the most vocal digital antitrust and anti-monopoly academics. This signals an increasing EU-US convergence on the need to achieve fully competitive, fairer, and more innovative digital markets. Third myth, on security and strategic autonomy, the story goes that Europe is naive and the US wants to leverage us for trade wars. Well, first of all, we do notice and we do welcome the fresh US commitment to multilateralism and to transatlantic relationships. And then, from a telecom and a 5G perspective, I must underline that EU telcos are working on their own Open RAN projects. Open RAN has emerged as a priority in the US. The success of this in Europe will also be measured against our ability to groom a European ecosystem of players and innovators in this field. This is an important step that our industry is taking to foster EU strategic autonomy, and we believe it should be supported by policymakers. Fourth and last, myths on socialist Europe and capitalist America are almost too silly to mention. However, let me say that I see a strong and renewed commitment to industrial policies. More importantly, these industrial policies have the Green Deal at their heart, a topic on which EU can bring considerable know-how to the transatlantic relationship. In Europe, I strongly believe in a vision by which our pro-competitive values and our fresh industrial policy plans converge to deliver industrial leadership, innovation, and sustainable growth. The EU has developed ambitious targets for the upcoming digital decade, and we hope that policy approaches will converge to help us deliver. To conclude, I think that the new Politico newsletter by Mark Scott definitely got the right title. There is indeed a digital bridge being built between Brussels and Washington, and EPNO is willing to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, you took my line. I was going to introduce Mark Scott, our chief tech correspondent and author of The Digital Bridge. You introduced him better than me. Turning the mic over now to you, Mark Scott, who's going to be leading our discussion today, which is going to start right now. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Lisa, for the shout out. That's very nice to hear this morning. Welcome. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's chief tech correspondent, and with me we have obviously Executive Vice President for the Commission, Margrethe Vestager, and U.S. Senator Mark R. There's a lot we want to discuss in about 35 minutes, so I'm just going to crack on. Maybe just turn to Executive Vice President first. There's a lot we can discuss around digital tax, competition policy, telecom regulation. There's a lot there. But just in the short term, where do you see that the focus should be in terms of the US-EU digital relationship? What are the priorities for you in terms of what should get done in the near term?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the invitation. I've been looking very much forward. And as you say, there are plenty of issues to choose from. I think the most important point here is the starting point, because not only do we have a relatively new commission, we also have a new US administration coming in with a fresh take, highly qualified people everywhere. But we also have a global situation that has changed. The debate when it comes to technology has changed over the last 5 to 7 years to be much more hands-on. And that is not only in the US and in Europe, it is also in Australia, in Canada, in India, in many jurisdictions. And lastly, we have a geopolitical systemic rivalry also to address, showing that democracies can make sure that technology can be trusted and that we can make the full of the innovative potential and make the full of what technology can offer in order to improve our societies and make them more inclusive. And I think a number of issues are quite obvious. It can be security of supply. We learned a lot during the pandemic as what it takes. It can be sort of the approach to artificial intelligence. And obviously, it can be the approach to antitrust and regulation of big tech. We know so many regulated sector. We just heard from one, the telecommunications sector. We know the financial sector being regulated, energy sectors being regulated. Obviously, the discussion about how to regulate the tech sector is a top priority.
Thank you for that. We didn't use the word China, but I presume the geopolitical implications are there. Senator, turning to you, we have security of supply, approach to AI, antitrust. For you, from the Washington perspective, where do you think the priority should be in the short term?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and it's great to be with the Executive Vice President again. We have done a couple of these joint Zooms over the pandemic here. The earlier speaker, Lise, I'm not sure I agree with her somewhat comic book characterizations of the United States or Europe. I'm not sure that's terribly helpful. Clearly, the last 4 years have been a challenge for those of us who believe in strong alliances. And the one comment she did make is right, is that we are unfortunately in the United States, we've not moved forward on policy. We still, over half the world has now embraced some level of privacy regulation modeled after GDPR. And while individual states in America, including mine, Virginia, have taken steps forward, we still have no national policy. I've put forward in Congress a series of rules that I hope will be acted upon that take on everything from data portability to data valuations to prohibitions on dark patterns to, I think, some thoughtful reform on Section 230. I do think there is a chance that we'll see a action this year on that legislation and others. I also think in the effort to move forward on cross EU and the United States, and frankly, this alliance of democracies, put forward legislation as well that I think will be addressed. We've actually built in to our recent defense bill, but I think really needs to be fleshed out now, where we have those democracies that would be willing to join together, particularly in terms of technology development, values-based technology development. Because Mark, as you mentioned, one of the things that was glaringly omitted, I think, from the earlier comments was mention of China. In China, we have a ferocious competitor, which has created what I call an authoritarian capitalism model, where they allow dramatic competition in the Chinese domestic market until a Chinese national champion emerges, Huawei in the case of 5G. And then that Chinese national champion gets remarkable backing from the Communist Party of China. And let me be clear, when I talk about China, my beef is with the Communist Party of China. It is not with the Chinese people. It is not with the Chinese diaspora, wherever they may appear, particularly in terms of Asian Americans in the United States. I think failure to call out bad actions from big tech, from the Chinese perspective, where is the EU investigation into Huawei or Alibaba or Baidu, is an omission. Because I do fear that what we are going to see as China moves forward, we've seen in 5G, but I know we'll touch on AI, we'll touch on quantum computing, other issues, that China advances its goals without the views towards transparency, without the goals towards human rights, and oftentimes, unfortunately, those biases against kind of shared values between the United States and the EU come through when China sets the standards, the rules, protocols of advancing technologies. This is, again, an area where we may have differences on digital taxes, but I think we need to align on the standard settings and rules and procedures process that underlines these advancing technologies. And there will be collaboration. I do think that the Biden administration, as the executive vice president said, I think got qualified, experienced people. We look to rebuild those ties with the EU. And frankly, when mention is made of Australia and Japan South Korea, those are the countries on the front line, particularly seeing some of the Chinese interference. They have been most willing to try to see if we can increase collaboration. So I hope we can discuss these matters, and I think we are much stronger together than kind of rehashing some of the caricatures that were put forward earlier by some folks.
Thank you for that. I was actually going to save China to let in the discussion, but as you bring it up, maybe just to steal your question to Margrethe Vestager, where is the investigation into Huawei, Alibaba, etc.? And do you not think the recent EU-China investment agreement doesn't really set the right tone in terms of promoting those democratic principles?
Well, I think what the investment agreement does is that it sets us at par with the U.S. Because the U.S. has, to some degree, more advanced relationship with China. So I think it's really important to recognize it for what it is, because it's not a Swiss knife. It will not solve everything, but it will solve some things. Among other things, to give better access to information and better access to European companies, bringing more reciprocity as to how open the European market actually is. So that is one thing. And the second thing is that we should not redo each other's investigations, because markets are different, the legal framework is different. That you will see even with jurisdictions as the US and the European Union, that even though we have a very, very close cooperation and have had it for decades, we don't necessarily do the same cases because the market situation may be different and the legal framework that we work in may be different. That being said, I think it's really important what Mark is saying here, that we have in common this idea of a value-based development of technology. And one of the things that we will push forward, it also is also to sort of change our global approach. If we enable financing, that financing also comes with governance principles and an approach that will reflect exactly that technology comes with values. That if you implement technology, it should not be in a way that would enable mass surveillance. It should be in a way where citizens actually see that this is for the benefit of an inclusive society, where I get opportunities from technology, not where I am made either the product or the pawn for an almighty state. And I think all the many different issues that we can and will discuss and concretely develop, it can be discussions about privacy, about how to enable a free flow of data, which is an absolute, I think, must do between the two jurisdictions. Well, all of that can develop, even though we will not have the same legislation in every detail, because there is a shared sense of purpose here. And that I feel very strongly. And again, now when hearing Mark speak about these things, I think that is the important starting point, because there will be plenty of discussions, but they will be guided by these fundamentals.
On the data flow question to you, Senator, one question that is very live right now is how do you keep the EU-US data flowing after Europe's highest court raised some serious concerns about national security agencies in the US accessing EU data in ways that go against EU rights. Do you think there's a way forward on that in terms of allowing the national security agencies in the US to legitimately keep people safe while also upholding, frankly, the fundamental rights that the European Union promotes?
Well, I think that there's a series of questions that you just raised, and let me try to touch briefly on a couple of them. One, the power of the internet is to have the free flow of data. And so the default to a data localization policies, I candidly think in many ways unravels part of the benefits that come from the internet. So I think Margrethe's, many of her positions about a fair tax code for some of the social media companies is a legitimate issue. I think the question of even how you get a tax regime, we're trying to sort through that again, revisit that question. Not only these social media companies, but so many multinationals now are finding ways to avoid all of our minimum taxation in both regimes. And I think whether it's the EU or the United States, finding some agreement on some base common, at least international taxation floor would be a critical step forward. When we get into the question of the NSA, this is an area I'm glad you raised it, Mark, because I increasingly believe that our failure to have any kind of joint cybersecurity policies or even joint cybersecurity norms could be something that could really be potentially devastating. A lot of attention came with the SolarWinds hack recently, where finally the administration did fully attribute it to the Russian services. 18,000 companies were attacked, penetrated by the SolarWinds effort. Luckily, it ended up becoming mostly a traditional espionage activity where information was exfiltrated from about 150 of those companies. This attack, though, while I don't believe, and I would ask Margrethe's comments or any of you from the European side, it didn't seem to have received as much attention in Europe, but we know, and many of the services in Europe know that, Russia also launched this from domestic servers in Germany and in the UK, in a series of countries. And the thing that, if we view this simply as espionage, when the malware that was implanted could have been turned into a complete denial of service, and we could have had a NotPetya type attack that would have completely brought the United States economy and potentially the European economy, if it was directed that way, to a halt. This is an area where there needs to be, I think, greater collaboration. I fear at times our European friends, and for that matter, even some of our friends in Asia, are hoping that if they keep their heads low on cyber, we can turn this into a U.S. versus Russia or U.S. versus China cyber exchange. Cyber knows no boundaries. We saw recently the Chinese do a similar cyber attack against Microsoft, the Half-Moon attack that's not received as much attention. But I think this, on this agenda item, and I think this will get us into this question about data flows, having some common agreements around cyber norms, what we may qualify as, while we may not like, but acceptable espionage, what we qualify as quasi-nation state attacks. Should there be some rules, just as we try to put some rules around nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, that certain types of cyber attacks towards hospitals or critical infrastructure should be prohibited? We're going to have to do this in collaboration. And let me go ahead and acknowledge that when there were efforts made 20 plus years ago in this effort, it was actually the United States that was the most reluctant to enter into these international norms. But I don't see how we sort through these questions about data flows without also trying to address at some level the very, very dangerous world around cybersecurity.
And then back to Brussels, I mean, that seems like a pretty clear pitch about let's work together. I mean, there's obviously things going on both at a national and a commission level. But to you, Margrethe Vestager, is that something to be brought up in the upcoming G7 meeting? Is that something you would take up with your, with your direct counterparts in DC? How do you respond?
Well, I think that cybersecurity will have to be part of every discussion that we have, because as our society digitizes, we become more and more vulnerable, and we will not be successful in making the best of the technology in health, in education, in fighting climate change, in better mobility, if we do not make sure that it is safe, because obviously people will not trust it if that is the case. It also goes for our democracies, where it's not necessarily hacking, but manipulation that happens online. Both our democracies have seen that happening. From the side of the European Union, we have also named some of those state sponsors of these issues. So I think it must be integrated. It cannot be that cybersecurity is just in one sort of cybersecurity environment and then added on. It must be integrated in everything we do, also because it must be integrated in sort of in our also basic digital skills, that we do not just buy anything, click on every link that comes our way, because then we ourselves becomes part of the vulnerability of the systems. Of course, this is a very first line of defense and somewhat trivial and primitive, but it has to be there as well. So no, I really welcome sort of the emphasis that Mark put on this issue, because obviously the hacks that we have seen also on a European side and a European scale, not only are they extremely costly, but they add a level of uncertainty to digitization that slows things down. And citizens should not accept that progress is slowed down when there are digital solutions that can make dealing with public authorities more convenient, that can make best world-class health expertise available, that can fight the pandemic. So no, I do appreciate this effort to put it on top of our agenda. My point would be that it has to be an integrated part in all the talks that we have.
We're approaching something that we would somewhere agree. I know and understand the reluctance our European friends have when people hear about this touching American security entities. And, you know, Americans have those same concerns. But I think the one thing, and I agree with Margrethe, that we have to integrate this from the beginning of the conversation and not bolt it on at the end of the package as an afterthought. But the conclusion that I've come to, and I am not an expert by any means, but the conclusion I've come to is that when a first-tier adversary, a China or Russia, brings their A-team of hackers against any private sector entity, or for that matter, even many government networks, chances are the adversary is going to be able to penetrate that network. So unless we have some level of shared information sharing, because digital hygiene alone will not keep them out, unless we have some ability to share information in a way where the information is anonymized, that it doesn't include PII, where you can have some level of mid-incident reporting. I mean, SolarWinds, they were in our systems for 6 months. We don't even have in the United States a requirement for a disclosure. Luckily, we had one of the cybersecurity firms voluntarily brought this information forward, but the level of vulnerability and the fact that our adversaries potentially could switch this from an espionage purpose to a denial of service or shutting down our systems means we're going to have to, I think, collaborate and have to touch on some of these issues, particularly when we're talking about whether it's the American or whether the European security services, how we do that in a way that doesn't diminish consumer confidence or say, oh my gosh, this is going to touch the American services. Because as Margrethe said, if we don't have that kind of sharing, are people going to really be willing to share, for example, their health data around COVID? I mean, we have seen, at least in the United States, when Google and Apple initially indicated that they would, they had this great app that was going to help monitor tracing around COVID. The take-up rate was awful in the United States because there were no privacy concerns addressed. I mean, we were not sure where else that information would take place. So we're going to need a set of rules, but we're also going to need a set of security requirements to sort this out. And I think we're still, I guess, the thing that's changed for me is over the last 8 to 10 months, this area has gone up much, much higher on my concern level as chair of the Intelligence Committee, because I see how penetrated our networks are, our European friends' networks are, our friends in Asia's networks are, and I think it just needs to be higher on the agenda.
I don't think that the average consumer individually, either in the US or Europe, is just solely concerned about foreign access. There's a lot of concern both how the large tech companies and even some of the domestic surveillance agencies use and access people's data. I would be remiss to not mention that we have new AI rules coming in Europe, or proposals on Wednesday, and the draft that was leaked last week could have described potential outright bans on certain levels of uses of this AI technology, particularly around law enforcement's use if it didn't meet certain requirements. Margaret, do you think this is maybe, as much as it does meet some concerns, you might be out of step with your US colleagues who haven't taken such a sort of radical step in terms of what they can and can't do with AI? And then to you, Mark, do you think putting in outright bans on certain types of AI uses, it would help improve people's trust in technology in the US? Maybe start with Brussels.
Well, the whole point in the AI proposal that we will table is not to be extremist, but to be balanced and proportional. So what our main focus will be on the limited number of use cases where there is a high risk towards fundamental values, like being discriminated, but where the huge bulk of AI will be untouched by this regulation. So, and I also, when it comes to the use by law enforcement, it's the same thing. Law enforcement already today, I think, have great use of AI. Not to disturb that. The point is to say when we go in and ask, I think, something quite reasonable of artificial intelligence that may be used to decide if you could get into university, if you can get a mortgage, if you can get into vocational training, if you can get a job. These are sort of life-turning events, and if they systematically say that a person of this race or person of this gender cannot come into consideration, to make it really trivial and brutal, then of course we would have a giant problem. But from the work that has been done, as now it has been ongoing for 3 years, with a high-level expert group, with the testing by 350 businesses, by the white paper, more than 1,200 entries from all different parts of society, NGOs, academic, business associations, every part of society contributing. I think what you will find, at least what I hope, is that we come up with something that is really balanced, and that is also, I think, aimed for a good starting point for a global discussion about how to make sure that citizens will trust services where AI is being used. Because the point of having strict requirements for high-risk AI is exactly to be able to use it. That's the entire point. Not to stop using it and being afraid of it and distrusting it, but to embrace it, to say, even in situations where there could be a risk of something fundamental being at stake, of course, we can embrace technology and use it for the best possible purpose.
Let me jump in and just add, I'm anxious to see what the EU has come up with, because this is an area that I'm still trying to learn. I still am not sure I even fully know how we define AI at this point. I mean, and Mark, we have seen in the United States, many jurisdictions are trying to prohibit, for example, police departments from using facial recognition. Yes, that's AI, but the algorithm that Facebook uses to send me to an inappropriate site because we don't have any Section 230 regulations, that is, I don't know whether I would call that algorithm AI or not. I think I would. So I actually think Margrethe's last answer was one I'd like to be able to think that the United States get to that same idea. How do we do this in a way that's safe, that gives us some ground rules, that allows us to use technology, but precludes this technology from, maliciously or even unknowingly be used as an item of prejudice? I think that is a great goal, and I'm looking forward to the EU papers, because this is something Eric Schmidt spent a long time on a similar commission in the United States, and it frankly has not penetrated the policy world that greatly yet.
I should also say the Eric Schmidt-led commission who came out with the last report did not ask for mandatory rules. I think they asked for voluntary standards. I'm conscious of 10 minutes, and thank you so much for everyone who's bringing in.
And let me just note that I am concerned long-term. Voluntary standards ended us up with the cyber concerns we have right now. Voluntary standards ended us up with Facebook, Google, and Twitter, basically putting out disinformation, misinformation. I'm not sure when we're talking about such large, powerful tools that we can get by with this on a voluntary basis only.
Thank you, Senator. That's a pretty good segue into the last sort of 10-ish minutes we have left. There is obviously ongoing discussions on both sides of the Atlantic about content moderation, misinformation, social media. In Europe, we have the Digital Services Act. In the US, and there's your legislation, Senator, around Section 230 and other proposals. A lot of this stuff is about trying to mitigate the worst effects of misinformation and disinformation, both by state and domestic actors. To you both, do you think right now, as we stand at the middle of April 2021, the social media companies have done enough in terms of mitigating these issues? And follow on from that, how would you expect Europe and the US to work with each other to create sort of a transatlantic coalition of the willing when the concept of free speech and other things on both sides of the Atlantic is somewhat different? Maybe start with the Commissioner.
Well, if we were happy, we could save both the Parliament and Council a lot of time discussing, in particular, the Digital Services Act, because two elements of that act, precisely on your question. One is to set up, a systemic redress mechanism. In developing the Digital Services Act, one of the important things for us was, of course, to balance the need to take down what is illegal offline, also online, while at the same time preserving freedom of expression. And this is why we maintained sort of the ban of general monitoring, because the risk of over or too much being taken down is, of course, enormous. And of course, I realize that it's much more troublesome. It's much more resource intensive to have redress mechanisms. But I think it's the only thing that can serve both ideas, that you want to get rid of what is illegal, but you also want to protect freedom of expression. And the second point of the Digital Services Act is for the parties here to be obliged to do a horizontal risk assessment. How does our services work? Is there a risk of undermining democratic procedures? Is there a risk of our services being used to manipulate people down a rabbit hole? And if these risks are found to be present, then also an obligation to mitigate those risks. And for me, this is really two important things that complement one another. And of course, that there is transparency to this, so that there also is an external audit to how this is done. Because this is a way also to make the companies responsible, taking specific and concrete action, while at the same time making sure that societal values are being present in the way that these services are delivered.
Let me just start with the question is, do I think they're doing enough? And the answer is no. And here is why I think we need, and we have greater challenge in the United States with our First Amendment, which is a obviously broader based right that needs to be protected. I think about communications I've had with Facebook senior management, where they are talking about all the things they've done to try to take down bad information about the COVID virus. Yet every day there's still parts of their giant machine that turns users onto fake solutions or misinformation. And it's almost like the enterprise has gotten so large that their voluntary efforts to take down cannot deal with the size of the beast. So what I've tried to put forward in legislation is something that preserves the First Amendment rights. If you want to say something stupid, you can have that right to say something stupid. That right may not mean that it gets to be amplified 3 billion times, but the individual right to say something wrong or stupid, you should still have that. But to say, how do we draw a narrow set of responsibilities? One, I'm not sure this should apply to that right should apply to all paid advertising. Now, in our bill, we may need to change a bit of that advertising distinction, but we are looking through that. There may be some need for some to make this more apply to some of the largest platforms, but we've got certain things like, if you can't violate civil rights laws in your normal course, why should platforms be protected? Why should Facebook be protected when some of their postings are violating fellow American civil rights, or when someone is the object of a harassment campaign that was brought up in what was called the famous Grindr case back in the United States, or I remember when Sheryl Sandberg herself even acknowledged that perhaps Facebook does owe some obligation to the Rohingya who were being massacred due to Facebook posts with the Myanmar government that was put forward by the military junta. So we've tried to draw some exemptions that say Section 230 should not protect you against these things that are already illegal in other spheres. And I think we've tried to strike that right balance. I think there is a growing sense. You have at one end of the political agenda this strange combination of both left and right in America that just says, let's get rid of it entirely. Donald Trump and even Joe Biden have both agreed. You then have some of the purists who are still thinking this is the late 90s. And I believe, at least in America, because we've been so slow to move on any of these areas, that content moderation will be done in bits and pieces rather than something expansive. And our so-called Safe Tech Act is, at least mine and a number of other folks, and I'll have some bipartisan support for this shortly, effort to at least start down that path. But again, this is an area where I'm following closely not only what the EU is doing, but what's happening around the world. I think the United States re-engaging, at least in things like multinational efforts like the Christchurch call, would be a step in the right direction as well.
Thank you for that, Senator. I'm conscious of time. I just want to ask you both the same question very quickly. Recently, we had the new Biden administration putting forward some new digital tax proposals that would global tax proposals that would take the current proposals from the OECD and expand them beyond big tech and look at the top 100 largest companies in the world. To you, Margrethe Vestager, are you supportive of such a plan? And then to you, Senator, and I just ask you both to keep it relatively short, would you be supportive of any OECD-backed global tax plan that focused solely on digital services and big tech? Thank you.
Well, I'll go first. So I'll let the executive vice president have the last word. I would take a look. I think where I'm starting is somebody that's very much involved in this tax debate in the United States right now. As well-intentioned as some of my friends might have been in 2017 at ending deferral and trying to make sure that multinationals don't keep their intellectual property one place and their production another, we didn't get it right. There was not a large amount of capital coming back into the United States. We do need to sort this through. I think the only way we can sort it through is in collaboration with the rest of the world. Whether there is a separate category around tech firms, you've probably got some convincing to do for me, but I do know the nature of these firms are different than certain other firms. If there was some movement on a global minimum taxation rate so that companies cannot continue to use our friends in Ireland as the out, when corporations in America only pay 1% of the country's GDP in taxes, when they pay a 3% generalized rate in Europe, that is unfair to Americans. And I think if we don't have this push to who can go to the lowest rate, we're going to have to do this in collaboration with our allies around the world.
Thank you for that. And the last word.
Well, it is absolutely key, the steps that the US has taken over the last couple of weeks, because without going into any kind of detail, it is one of the most urgent global debates that we have to have a sense of tax fairness. We have, the huge majority of businesses, they're small. They work really hard to create a turnover, from that a profit, from that they pay their taxes, because they cannot organize themselves. They might not want to organize themselves because they contribute to the society where they do their business. And for that also to be the case for the remaining businesses, that is something I think every citizen would, get their shoulders down, feel that now, at last, there is some sort of fairness in this area. And I really commend the changes that the US has made in their position over the last weeks. I do hope that this will be conducive to an OECD agreement so that we can get a global approach to this, because that would bring the world forward with giant steps. I have learned not to expect a lot and not to expect it fast, but I am really encouraged by these new signals.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I think we're going to close the event, and apologies for those who put in questions. Just there's a lot to cover, from China to digital tax in 35 minutes. So with that, I want to say thank you to both our speakers, Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager calling in from Brussels, and U.S. Senator Mark Warner, I presume from Washington. I also thank you so much for attending the event. I hope you enjoyed it. And plug for me, I write about this weekly in my Digital Bridge newsletter. Please sign up now. I would really appreciate it. Also, thanks to our sponsor, Etno, for helping us put on this event. There's a lot more events coming from Politico, probably virtually because of COVID in the months to come. So please check that out on our website. And with that, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a whole lot. Mark has said what there was to be said. I'm not going to add much, just to say, recap some of what we've heard here today. We've heard a strong call for common cybersecurity standards. We had a sneak peek at what the EU is going to put on the table in terms of AI proposals from the Executive Vice President of the Commission. We've heard about common initiatives on content moderation, and we've had a vote of optimism for a fair taxation from both sides of the Atlantic. That's my 2 cents. Thank you all for tuning in. Keep the conversation going online. Thanks again to our partner Etno, and have a look at our website at politico.eu/events/future events for other exciting lineups like we had today. Thanks.